My neighbor thought he could steal my land with a smirk and a shiny new fence. But one phone call turned his $7 million mansion into dust. This is Jake's revenge, and you won't believe how it all unfolded. My name is Ezra. I'm 47 years old, an environmental consultant for the past 22 years. I know every wetland regulation in Oregon like the back of my hand, every setback requirement, every permit needed for construction near sensitive areas. What I was looking at made my stomach turn, but not for the reasons Garrett thought. His fence post gleamed silver in the morning sun, cutting a clean line through what used to be the natural buffer zone between our properties. Garrett had moved fast. The whole thing went up over the weekend while I was visiting my daughter in Seattle. Clean work, professional installation, expensive. But here's the kicker, that fence was 6 feet into my property, and Garrett thought he could get away with it. Stay tuned to Jake's revenge to see how his arrogance cost him everything. I'll handle it properly, I told him, keeping my voice level. He adjusted his designer sunglasses and grinned wider. Handle it properly? What's that supposed to mean? His voice carried that tone rich people get when they think they're untouchable. I've got the best lawyers in Portland. This fence isn't going anywhere. I looked past him at his mansion, $7 million of marble, glass, and arrogance sitting on what used to be the Hendricks family farm. The old house had been torn down 2 years ago when Garrett bought the place from Mrs. Hendricks after her husband died. She needed the money for medical bills. Garrett needed a trophy property to match his tech company success. We'll see, I said. Behind Garrett, I could see his wife, Vanessa, watching from their kitchen window. She waved, probably thinking this was just neighborly small talk. Their twin boys, maybe 8 years old, were kicking a soccer ball on their pristine lawn. Normal family stuff, if you ignored the fact that their father just stole 6 feet of my land. Look, Ezra, I know you're upset about this, but it's just property lines. Nobody really knows exactly where they are anyway. Garrett kicked at one of my survey stakes that he'd pulled up to make room for his fence. Besides, what are you going to do with that strip of weeds? I'm actually improving the neighborhood. That strip of weeds he was talking about was a natural wetland buffer, protected for decades. The original survey from when I bought my place 15 years ago clearly marked it as part of my property. But more importantly, it was part of a protected habitat area that extended down to the creek running behind both our houses. Something cold settled in my chest as I watched Garrett walk back toward his house. He had no idea what he'd just done. No idea at all. Want to know what happens when you mess with the wrong neighbor? Keep watching Jake's Revenge. I bought my place in Beaverton 15 years ago, right after my divorce, 3 acres of mixed woodland and wetland. Nothing fancy, but it backed up to protected creek habitat that connected to the Tualatin River system. The house was a simple 2-story built in the 80s, with siding that needed paint and a deck that sagged on one corner. Perfect for a guy who wanted space and quiet. My work kept me traveling around the Pacific Northwest, consulting on environmental impact assessments for everything from shopping centers to housing developments. I'd seen what happened when developers cut corners, when they thought regulations were suggestions instead of law, the fines, the legal battles, the projects that got shut down mid-construction. Most people had no idea how serious the state was about wetland protection. Garrett had moved in 2 years ago with big plans and bigger money. His tech company, some kind of software that managed supply chains for manufacturers, had gone public and made him wealthy overnight. The first thing he did was tear down the old farmhouse and build his monument to success, $7 million for a house with 6 bedrooms, 8 bathrooms, and a 3-car garage that cost more than most people's homes. He'd introduced himself the day after moving in, bringing over a bottle of expensive wine and talking about how we were going to be great neighbors. Asked me what I did for work, seemed impressed when I mentioned environmental consulting. Must be interesting, he'd said. All that technical stuff. The warning signs had been there for months. Small things at first. His landscaping crew had started dumping yard waste near the property line instead of hauling it away. Their sprinkler system was spraying onto my side of the boundary. I'd mentioned it to Garrett a couple times, and he'd always said he'd look into it, but nothing changed. Then came the bigger issues. His contractor had parked equipment on my land during construction of his outdoor kitchen. When I asked them to move it, they said Garrett told them it was fine. I had to walk over and explain the property lines myself. Garrett apologized, said there must have been some confusion. But I saw the look in his eyes. He was testing me. The fence was just the latest move, but it was different. This was permanent. This was him taking what wasn't his and daring me to stop him. What he didn't know was that in doing environmental work, you learn to be patient. You document everything. You understand that the worst violations often look like small problems at first until someone with the right knowledge takes a closer look. I'd been watching his property for 2 years, noting things that bothered me professionally but weren't my business to report until now. I spent that afternoon walking the fence line with my old survey maps, measuring distances, and taking photos. The fence ran exactly 6 feet into my property for about 200 yards from the road to where the land sloped down toward the creek. Garrett had been careful. The installation was professional. The posts were straight, and the surveyor stakes that marked my boundary had been pulled up and tossed aside. But standing there with my measuring tape, something else caught my attention. The fence didn't just cross into my property. It crossed into the wetland buffer zone. That was a different kind of problem entirely. I pulled out my phone and opened the environmental database I used for work. According to state records, the creek behind our properties was classified as critical salmon habitat. The wetland buffer zone extended 30 feet from the high water mark on both sides. Garrett's fence now cut directly through protected habitat that had been undisturbed for decades. That evening, I sat on my deck with a beer and really looked at his property for the first time in months. The mansion itself was beautiful, no question about that. But from my angle, I could see how close he'd built to the creek. Too close, maybe. The outdoor kitchen and pool area seemed to be right at the edge of what should have been the setback area. I went inside and pulled out the environmental impact reports I'd collected when he first started construction. As a professional courtesy, I'd requested copies from the county just to see how they'd handled the wetland issues. The permit showed setbacks, buffers, and restrictions that were supposed to protect the habitat. But looking at his finished project, I wasn't sure those restrictions had been followed. I made some coffee and spread the original environmental survey across my kitchen table. The protected area was clearly marked, along with the required 30-foot buffer. According to the permits, nothing permanent could be built within that zone. The fence was bad enough, but if the house itself was in violation. I sat back in my chair and really thought about what I was seeing. Garrett had spent $7 million on a property that might have been built illegally. The fence was just the piece that made it my problem. I thought about Mrs. Hendricks, how she'd cried when she signed the papers to sell her family's farm, how Garrett had promised to respect the land's natural beauty during the neighborhood association meeting where he'd presented his building plans. How he'd looked me in the eye today and laughed about taking my property. I finished my coffee and reached for my phone. Time to make a call to someone who would be very interested in what I discovered. The next morning, I walked over to Garrett's house around 9 a.m. He answered the door in workout clothes, probably heading to his home gym. "Ezra, what brings you by so early?" "That fence," I said. "I need you to move it back to the actual property line." His smile faded. "I told you yesterday, that fence isn't moving. I had it surveyed. It's exactly where it should be." "You had it surveyed by who?" "My contractor's guy. Professional surveyor, licensed and everything." He crossed his arms. "Look, I understand you're upset, but I'm not upset," I said. "I'm telling you the fence is on my property, and it needs to move." Garrett's face changed. The friendly neighbor mask slipped off completely. "You know what your problem is, Ezra? You're stuck in the past. This whole area is changing. Property values are going up. I'm improving things around here, and you're worried about 6 feet of weeds. Those weeds are protected wetland habitat." He laughed. "Wetland? It's a drainage ditch with some grass around it. Don't try to scare me with environmental nonsense. It's not nonsense. Your fence crosses into a 30-foot buffer zone that's been protected since the creek was designated critical salmon habitat. That's a state violation. For the first time, Garrett looked uncertain, but it only lasted a second. You're bluffing, he said. I have all the permits. Everything was approved by the county. If there were environmental issues, they would have told me. Maybe they did, and you ignored them. His eyes narrowed. You threatening me? I'm explaining the situation. No, you're trying to intimidate me because you're jealous of what I've built here. Well, guess what? I didn't get where I am by backing down from bitter old men who can't handle progress. I started to respond, but he held up his hand. Here's what's going to happen, he said. You're going to accept that the fence stays where it is, or I'm going to make your life very difficult. I've got lawyers, I've got money, and I've got connections. You want to fight me over 6 feet of mud? Bring it on. That afternoon, Garrett made good on his threat. A certified letter arrived from his attorney, claiming that I was harassing his client and threatening frivolous litigation. The letter demanded that I cease all contact regarding the fence and warned of legal action if I continued to interfere with legal improvements to the property. But that wasn't the worst part. By evening, I'd received calls from 3 neighbors asking what was going on. Garrett had been calling around the neighborhood, telling people I was trying to cause problems over some imaginary property dispute. He painted me as the difficult neighbor, the guy who couldn't accept that the area was improving. Dorothy from 2 houses down stopped by around dinner time. Ezra, honey, I heard you and Garrett are having some kind of disagreement. He moved his fence onto my property. Well, I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding. He seems like such a nice man. His wife brought me cookies when my husband was in the hospital last month. Dorothy, he took 6 feet of my land without asking. But it's just a little piece, right? Maybe you could work something out. I'd hate to see neighbors fighting. After she left, I realized what Garrett was doing. He was isolating me, making it seem like I was the unreasonable one in a neighborhood where most people barely knew their property lines and just wanted to get along. I was the guy causing drama over something they couldn't see or understand. My phone rang around 8 p.m. Unknown number. This Ezra? Yes. This is Detective Williams with Beaverton Police. I understand you've been having some kind of dispute with your neighbor. My stomach dropped. What kind of dispute? Mr. Garrett called this afternoon. Says you've been threatening him and his family. Wanted us to know in case things escalate. After I hung up with the police, I sat in my kitchen feeling like I'd been sucker punched. Garrett had played this perfectly. He'd stolen my land, isolated me from the neighbors, and now had the police thinking I was some kind of threat. All in less than 24 hours. But he'd made one mistake. He'd pushed me hard enough that I wasn't thinking about being neighborly anymore. I opened my laptop and logged into the state environmental database. As a licensed consultant, I had access to detailed records that most people never saw. I pulled up every document related to Garrett's property development, every permit application, every environmental review. What I found made me sit back and whistle low. The original environmental impact assessment had flagged multiple concerns. The proposed building site was within 50 feet of the creek, which required special mitigation measures. The report specifically mentioned that any permanent structures needed to maintain the 30-foot buffer zone from the high water mark. Most importantly, the final approval was conditional on a post-construction environmental compliance review that was supposed to happen within 6 months of completion. The house had been finished 14 months ago. No compliance review had ever been conducted. I kept digging. The original site plan showed the house positioned to maintain all required setbacks, but the satellite imagery from last year showed something different. The actual building footprint was at least 20 feet closer to the creek than the approved plans indicated. I pulled up the wetland delineation report that had been required for the permits. The protected area was clearly marked with GPS coordinates and detailed boundary descriptions. According to the survey, the wetland buffer started exactly where Garrett's new fence now stood. His fence wasn't just crossing into my property. It was marking the beginning of protected habitat that his house had been built right through. My phone buzzed with a text from my daughter, Jessica. "Dad, heard you're having neighbor trouble. Everything okay?" I stared at the message, wondering how word had already reached Seattle. Then I realized Garrett probably had social media, probably posted about his difficult neighbor online. The story was spreading. I spent the next hour documenting everything I'd found: screenshots of the satellite imagery, copies of the permit conditions, photos of the fence location with GPS coordinates. If Garrett wanted to play hardball, I had the ammunition he didn't know existed. But before I made any moves, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. I called Tony Reeves, an old friend who worked for the State Department of Environmental Quality. "Tony, it's Ezra. I need to ask you something off the record." "What's up?" "Hypothetically, if someone built a house in violation of wetland setback requirements and there was never a post-construction compliance review, what would happen if DEQ found out?" "Hypothetically, they'd be in deep trouble. We take wetland violations seriously, especially in critical habitat areas. Could be looking at restoration orders, heavy fines, even criminal charges if it was willful." "What kind of restoration orders?" "Depends on the severity. Worst case scenario, they'd have to remove whatever structures were built in the protected zone and restore the habitat to its original condition." "Even if it was a house?" "Even if it was a house. We've ordered demolitions before. Not often, but when someone blatantly ignores environmental law, we don't mess around." After I hung up, I sat staring at my laptop screen. Garrett's $7 million dream house might be sitting in the middle of a protected wetland. The fence was just the tip of the iceberg. I thought about his laugh this morning, his threats, his calls to the neighbors and police. He declared war over 6 feet of my property, not knowing he was vulnerable to losing everything. Time to make that phone call. I called the Department of Environmental Quality Enforcement hotline at 8 a.m. sharp. Professional to professional. DEQ Enforcement, this is Janet. This is Ezra Hammond, licensed environmental consultant. I need to report a potential wetland violation in critical salmon habitat. Can you hold for compliance supervisor? A minute later. This is Director Walsh. What do you have? A residential structure that appears to have been built in violation of wetland setback requirements, plus a new fence that's been placed directly across protected habitat buffer zone. I gave him the address and my consultant license number. I can provide GPS coordinates, satellite imagery, and copies of the original permits that show the violations. Send everything to my email. We'll have someone out there within 48 hours. I spent the morning preparing a comprehensive report: satellite photos showing the house position versus the approved site plan, survey maps with the wetland boundaries clearly marked, photos of the fence cutting through the buffer zone, the original environmental impact assessment with all its unmet conditions. But I also included something else: the enforcement history for similar violations, cases where DEQ had ordered partial or complete demolition of structures built in protected areas, the legal precedents that showed they didn't make exceptions for expensive houses or wealthy owners. While I was working, I watched Garrett through my office window. He was in his backyard, showing off the fence to someone, probably another neighbor, spreading his version of the story, pointing at my property, shaking his head like I was the unreasonable one. Around noon, my phone rang. "Jessica. Dad, I've been thinking about your neighbor situation. Maybe you should just let the fence thing go. I know it's the principle, but is it worth all the stress?" Even my own daughter thought I should back down. Garrett's strategy was working perfectly. "I'm handling it properly," I told her, same words I'd used with Garrett 2 days ago. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm going to let the appropriate authorities sort this out." "Authorities?" "Dad, please don't turn this into some big legal thing. It's just a fence." After we hung up, I finished my report and sent it to Director Walsh. Then I waited. That evening, Garrett came to my door. Different approach this time. Friendly smile, bottle of wine in his hand. "Ezra, I think we got off on the wrong foot yesterday. I know you're upset about the fence, and I want to work something out." "What kind of something?" I'll pay you for the 6 feet. Fair market value, plus a little extra for the inconvenience. We can get it appraised.